In this final video, I would like to address two broad topics. First, the interpretive question about how best to understand the plot, and second, some thematic highlights of the novel. The first question that always arises with The Double is, what on earth is actually happening? Like Henry James' ghost story, The Turn of the Screw, The Double is designed to leave you guessing. The two main alternatives are, on the one hand, to take the narration at face value, and on the other, to claim that Golyadkin is hallucinating. But these two alternatives are really poles on a spectrum, and our task as readers is to determine which of Golyadkin's experiences are veridical and which are not. If we remain content with a surface-level reading, then we will inherit problems. There is no question that Golyadkin is psychologically unbalanced. We are talking of a man who often loses awareness of what he is doing, and, so to speak, wakes up in the middle of a public place. A man who will unwittingly rant and rave in the middle of a restaurant before everyone. A man whose paranoia only increases over time to the point where he thinks his doctor is trying to murder him with a sinister drug prescription, to say nothing of his hopeless inability to navigate his social world. Now, if we adopt a surface-level reading, observe the sorts of things we must concede. An identical twin materializes almost out of thin air one night, and like a phantom heads directly for Golyadkin's apartment, mysteriously disappears by the next morning, somehow behaves in real life exactly as he does in Golyadkin's dream, and so on, all the way down to a nightmarish denouement, at which point Rutenspitz's eyes glow red in the darkness. If we decide on a surface-level read, then we are left with a surreal, fantastic story which dabbles in the supernatural. Why should we postulate the supernatural when we already know that Golyadkin is very likely mad? The more plausible line seems to be that he is hallucinating. But if we flip the script, then we inherit other problems. There seem, after all, to be two, maybe three independent witnesses to the double. Anton Antonovitch is happy to discuss this other Golyadkin at some length in Chapter 6. From Chapter 7 on, Petrushka appears to acknowledge the existence of the double, offering to set dinner for two when Golyadkin Jr. is a guest, referring to the other one the following morning, and even momentarily taking that other one to be his real master, expressing his dissatisfaction with Golyadkin on the grounds that honest people don't have doubles, and alluding to some enemy of Golyadkin's in Chapter 12. And then there is a letter from Vakramiev, in which Vakramiev appears to affirm the existence of another person of the same name as Golyadkin living in his building. In the face of this evidence, how can we claim that the double is a mere hallucination? Yet this counter-evidence is itself suspect. Let's begin with Vakramiev. Vakramiev never makes his way onto the narrative stage, and we learn of him only through his letter. But the accounts given of most all the letters in the novel are unreliable. Did Golyadkin ever write that first letter to his double? When Petrushka returns from his errand hopelessly drunk, he sometimes testifies that there was no letter to deliver at all. What of Golyadkin's letter to Vakramiev? He seems to think that he left it on the table before going to bed, but it has disappeared by the time he awakes. The last letter from Clara Osofievna has all the appearance of Golyadkin's imagination, rather than what we could expect from the flesh-and-blood character, even to the point of invoking the very language that Golyadkin himself had used earlier. For instance, that innocence is strong in its very innocence. By the next chapter, Golyadkin's imagination has added even more details to the letter, about living in a hut by the seashore and so on. Vakramiev's letter strikes me as being of this sort. It seems to materialize suddenly on the table in the middle of the night as Golyadkin is fretting, and before he begins to read, Golyadkin confesses that he has already had a presentiment of everything that will appear in the letter. In other words, there are signs that the letter may itself be a hallucination. On the other hand, the text does not give us any special reason to believe that Anton Antonovich is a hallucination, and Anton Antonovich affirms that there is another clerk there by the name of Golyadkin, and in the end seems to affirm that this other Golyadkin looks almost exactly like the protagonist. But he doesn't volunteer this judgment. His first reaction is that there is a mere family resemblance, and at this point no one else in the office seems to notice anything remarkable about the new clerk's appearance. The verdict that the other clerk is almost identical in appearance is produced only by Golyadkin persistently leading the witness, and so we might wonder whether it's a reliable judgment, or indeed whether this part of the conversation actually happened at all the way it is narrated. The toughest nut to crack is Petrushka, given the kinds of things he says. Why should he offer dinner for two if he does not see the second person? Why should he refer to some other one who went to the office the following morning if there had been no other guest? Why should he talk about doubles if he hadn't witnessed one? However, Petrushka, unlike Anton Antonovich, seems an unreliable witness. When he offers to set the table for two, he is looking at the far corner of the room, away from Golyadkin. Why is that? Perhaps he has witnessed his master interacting with an imaginary phantom, is put off by the awkwardness of his situation, and plays along with his master's delusion. The following morning, when, in his typically surly fashion, he insists that his master has already gone off to work, could this not be Petrushka carrying forward the ruse of the previous evening in a vindictive way? By the time he is talking about doubles that night, he is drunk, and may well be referring to the delusion of his master, not a flesh-and-blood person. In general, we could always sweep away countervailing evidence by simply claiming that the counter-evidence itself is a hallucination, although that move will feel like cheating since it renders the hallucination interpretation in principle unfalsifiable. In the end, I think we have a parity of evidence, and so we are left with an indeterminate answer to whether we are dealing with a surreal, fantastic horror story or a horrifying story of a man's madness. Further, I suspect that this indeterminacy is by design. Indeed, we might wonder whether the reality of the double matters, for in the mind of a madman, the empirical world of sense just is a surreal world of fantasy. And perhaps this is not merely a conclusion about the insane. As the philosophical descendants of Kant will hasten to insist, the world we experience is to some extent the world we create. But I digress. I confess, however, that I favor the interpretation that the double is a hallucination, not because the text demands this conclusion, but because of what I take Dostoevsky's primary focus in the novel to be. I think he is much less interested in fantasy than he is in psychology, and so prefer to sanitize the narrative of distracting supernatural elements. And it is the psychology of the novel that I want to address next. As I noted in the introduction, Dostoevsky never let go of his commitment to the ideas behind The Double, despite its poor critical reception. Why is that? I suspect that this is because the ideas presented here are fundamental to what he does in all of his mature writings. Mikhail Bakhtin famously called the characters of Dostoevsky polyphonic, by which he meant that they would tend to speak with multiple, often conflicting voices. In doing so, the minds of his characters are more exposed to our gaze than the characters of other novels, whose voices have been ironed out by the author in a clear, univocal presentation. He doesn't delve all the way down to the chaos of unformed thought in the way that James Joyce does via the stream of consciousness that we see in Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake. These characters are attempting to express their ideas, but their ideas are torn in multiple directions, and so they find themselves in self-contradictions, changing directions several times in the course of a single paragraph, in the way that you and I might do as we are working through a problem during a time of distress. This is not typically madness, although it might seem so as you read. Rather, it is candid disclosure, as Dostoevsky unveils what is going on in the heads of people with uncanny skill. In The Double, we see this idea of polyphony being developed more explicitly than it is anywhere else. Here, the multiple voices get symbolic representation in the form of two instantiations of Golyadkin. But it is not as though we really need the presence of the double to witness the multiple voices inside Golyadkin. In fact, as I reflect on the story, it seems to me that we know everything we need to know about our protagonist by the end of chapter 2. After that, it seems as though events simply follow an ineluctable trajectory to the madhouse. Further, the double doesn't do anything to mitigate the multiple voices of Golyadkin Sr. He doesn't siphon off any of these voices, and the polyphony of our protagonist continues all the way through to the end. By the end of chapter 2, we know what Golyadkin's aims are. He desperately wants to advance in society and be respected as a success. We know, however, that he is hopelessly at a loss in understanding social norms and cues. He absurdly hires a carriage and dresses Petrushka up in ridiculous livery, stumbles through his interaction with Rutenspitz, and so on. We know that he has a proclivity for paranoia, coming close to weeping over his supposed enemies. Crucially, we also know that he wants to be precisely the thing that he rails against, has multiple images of himself, and is capable of dissociating from himself. When covering for his social ineptitude in the beginning of his interview, Golyadkin insists that he takes pride in his simplicity, his honesty, his refusal to offer perfumed compliments or to wear masks, and that he is not one to polish the floor with his boots. By the end of the interview, as he finally develops some confidence, he is speaking cryptically, dishonestly, wearing a mask, and even finishes by scraping the floor with the toe of his boot. And it is at this stage of the discussion that Golyadkin is most satisfied with himself. We know what Golyadkin protests that he is on the one hand, and what he truly aspires to be on the other. We further have an intimation that he will never succeed in becoming what he truly aspires to be. This tension, of course, is played out throughout the novel, with Golyadkin frequently protesting his innocence and openness, while at the same time plotting intrigues against his imagined enemies, even inviting his double to join him in the scheming. If we were in a moralizing frame of mind, we might call Golyadkin a hypocrite. But the term seems hollow here. Dostoevsky is simply describing what we are. We are people who will love in secret what we hate in public. And both attitudes may be perfectly genuine. Anyone who has the courage to actually have a sexual ethic in our day and age might testify to this. And I think this might explain why, in another day and age, in Victorian England, stories about doubles like Jekyll and Hyde and Dorian Gray were so intensely popular. The conflict between these two voices is what precipitates the appearance of the double in chapter 5. At that point, after the disaster at Olsevy Ivanovitch's, we see Golyadkin attempting to run away from himself. He never does quite succeed in doing so, and he remains his polyphonic self throughout the course of the novel. His double, rather, is the manifestation of what he earnestly wishes he could succeed in becoming, a devious, successful, socially savvy bureaucrat. We see him being split in other ways as well. What is his attitude towards Clara Osofievna, for instance? He fantasizes about rescuing her from a falling chandelier, and he seems enamored of the damsel in distress that he seems to imagine in her supposed letter. But he also calls her an impudent slut in chapter 3, and spends much of chapters 12 and 13 ranting against the silliness of a girl who wants to play that role of the damsel in distress. Further, his attitude towards his double keeps shifting as well, from acrimony to tenderness and back again, even after the double has revealed himself a villain. Throughout it all, we also have the multiple ways Golyadkin speaks about himself. In the third person, the second person, the first person singular, the first person plural, the Freudian projection, the multiple protests about what he is and what he is not, the whole 9 yards. The story is a psychologist's playground. But as interesting as the story is psychologically, we can't forget that there is a social point here as well. After all, the subtitle of the story is A Petersburg Poem, and Golyadkin is through and through a product of Petersburg. As he hosts his double in chapter 7, he reveals that he embraces the Western ideals it represents, and his ambitions are to climb the bureaucratic ladder that Peter created, and which Dostoevsky derides at the beginning of chapter 4. That ambition is, after all, the driving impetus of what wrecks him, and so Golyadkin, like the hero of Pushkin's story The Bronze Horseman, ultimately loses everything, including his mind, to the legacy of Peter the Great. And given the allusions that are present in the story, I think Dostoevsky is quite deliberate about this parallelism. At the beginning of this compilation, I invited you to judge the quality of this story for yourself. By my own assessment, I think it is probably the best thing that Dostoevsky wrote prior to his imprisonment in Siberia. But take this with 3 grains of salt. First, he wrote several short works during this time that are rather obscure, and which I haven't read. Second, I don't know how I would judge the original 1846 presentation of the double. We are, after all, reading the story after it had been edited by the mature Dostoevsky years later. Third, I can't claim that it's the most enjoyable piece from this period. Several features of the story are placed there very deliberately that are off-putting to the average reader. The confusion concerning what is going on, the unreliable narrator, all the verbal tics of the protagonist, and so on. These features are a credit to the novel's worth, but perhaps a discredit to its readability. And so we've reached the end of this Let's Read. If you think I've butchered this analysis, I'm sure you will take my invitation to let me know in the comments section below, with all the courtesy with which the internet is so renowned. I'm unsure of what's next for me. I've already done Poor Folk. The last celebrated work by Dostoevsky in this early period is a lengthy short story entitled White Nights. But he wrote several other short stories during this period, and even another brief novella called The Landlady. If you witness me herring off after these other stories, you'll know the depth of my addiction. If I'm wise, I might just choose to get back to my day job. We shall see. Regardless, thanks for joining me on this little excursion through the double, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.